Islam Dulatov's story does not begin under the bright lights of the UFC, and it definitely does not begin on a Versace runway with cameras flashing from every direction. It begins on August 2nd, 1998, in Uris Martan, a small city in Chechnya, at a time when the entire region was being dragged through one of the darkest periods in its modern history. The Second Chechen War erupted the following year, so violence, uncertainty, and the constant fear that everything could change overnight surrounded nearly all of Islam's early childhood. He was raised in a massive family with 6 brothers, and when you grow up with that many boys in a place where normal life has been torn apart, your brothers become your friends, your training partners, your protection, and sometimes your entire world. The family reportedly moved around Chechnya searching for safety, and consistent schooling was hard to come by. Islam and his brothers spent their time outdoors, challenging one another with body weight exercises and finding ways to help their parents. Childhood in that environment was not organized around hobbies, summer vacations, and planning 10 years ahead. The adults were trying to keep the family together while the children learned to adapt to whatever the next day brought. Islam was too young to control any of it, but those years placed toughness into him before fighting ever became a profession. When your earliest memories come from a region where stability can disappear without warning, pressure inside a locked cage probably feels different. There is a referee, a clear opponent, and a set amount of time. Compared with the confusion surrounding war, even a fight has rules. This was not some polished origin story created after he became famous. There were no expensive gyms, private coaches, or parents financing a dream. These were children living through instability and learning very early that survival usually came before comfort. In December of 2007, when Islam was 9 years old, the family finally left Chechnya and entered Germany as war refugees. Leaving meant walking away from the language, familiar streets, relatives, and whatever pieces of home the conflict had not already disturbed. Dusseldorf gave them safety, but safety did not instantly make life easy. Islam arrived unable to speak the language, stepped into a school system he did not understand, and suddenly found himself surrounded by people whose lives looked completely different from his own. He has admitted that those years were hard and even embarrassing because the family had so little. The brothers took physical jobs, including unloading trucks, and helped bring money home while everyone tried to establish a new life. Just sit with that image for a second, man. The guy who would eventually wear Versace in Milan and knock people unconscious in the UFC was once a kid carrying boxes in a country where he could barely communicate. That is the real beginning of the story. Germany did not hand the Dulatovs a beautiful new life. It handed them an opportunity, and then the family had to build everything else themselves. Sports became one of the first places Islam no longer needed perfect German to understand what was happening. Effort made sense. Discipline made sense. Standing across from another young man and proving that you belong made sense. At 14, he entered boxing, and the rhythm of the gym gave structure to all the energy he had been carrying since Chechnya. By 18, he had moved into mixed martial arts, where striking alone was not enough and every part of his game had to grow. Fighting helped him integrate into Germany, but it also kept him connected to the toughness and brotherhood that had carried the family there. Long before anyone knew the nickname The Ripper, Islam had already survived the part of his life that no opponent could recreate inside a cage. Those lessons formed the calm that made future chaos inside the cage feel strangely familiar. Then the story takes this turn that sounds fake until you actually look at the photographs. While Islam and his brothers were learning how to fight, their oldest brother Jibril was discovered by a modeling agency and began working with major fashion houses. Jibril eventually opened the same door for Islam and several of the younger brothers, and suddenly this family of Chechen refugees living in Dusseldorf was stepping into an industry that probably felt like another planet. Islam was scouted through Instagram, and the same 6'3" frame that made him dangerous at welterweight made him impossible for casting directors to ignore. In 2018, when he was only 19, Versace booked him exclusively for his first season in Milan. British Vogue then placed him among the 10 standout male models of that season. We are not talking about a fighter taking a few clean pictures for social media and calling himself a model. He was walking major runways, working with Versace, appearing in GQ, and becoming connected with names such as Gucci, Hugo Boss, and Tommy Hilfiger. He shared fashion spaces with global stars including Gigi and Bella Hadid, and built a resume with dozens of professional runway, editorial, campaign, and lookbook credits. Agents were investing in his appearance, while Islam participated in a sport where one elbow could split his eyebrow and one broken nose could change his face. The contradiction followed him everywhere. One minute he was surrounded by fighters in a sweaty gym, and the next he was in expensive clothes with the fashion world studying every detail of his face. Somehow, the two lives never fully fought each other. Islam trained every day, sometimes twice a day, and when modeling sent him across Europe, he ran in the morning, shadow boxed in hotel rooms, found whatever gym was available, and kept himself ready. He was not hiding the fighting from his agents either. The scars, the hard expression, and the physical build were part of what made him different. In a business built around appearance, he arrived with an actual story written across the way he carried himself. He also refused to perform the tough guy character every hour of the day. In a 2019 interview with GQ Germany, Islam explained that being a fighter did not mean hiding his emotions after a victory or a defeat. That little detail matters because it separates the man from the nickname. The Ripper is the person who enters the cage. Islam is still a brother, a son, a Muslim, and a young man who remembers what it felt like to arrive in Germany with nothing. As the modeling money came in, the brothers helped their parents, invested in businesses, and eventually built their own training home at 111 Gym in Dusseldorf. Islam has been blunt about people assuming that his success came from a wealthy family. His position is that he and his brothers made their parents comfortable, not the other way around. That hunger explains why fighting kept pulling him back. Even when modeling offered a much safer path, he could earn good money without getting punched, protect his face, travel the world, and live a life most young fighters could not imagine. Yet none of it gave him the same feeling as competition. He was willing to pass on valuable shoots for fights that paid far less, and on at least one occasion, he reportedly lost the modeling job only for the fight to fall apart too. Still, he kept choosing MMA. It was never desperation. The family had already built stability. Islam fought because the belt in his head meant more than another campaign, and honestly, that makes the choice even crazier. A broke fighter entering a cage because he needs rent money is understandable. A successful model risking the very face that created his fortune because he genuinely loves combat is a different type of obsession. Even at the peak of his fashion success, the gym remained the one place where status, clothing, and camera angles meant nothing at all. Before the UFC hype, there had to be a period where Islam learned what the sport could take away from him, and that lesson arrived immediately. He began competing as an amateur around 2016, collecting experience through a handful of bouts and learning that athleticism alone could not carry him through every position. Those early contests gave him a triangle choke loss, a knockout win, and submission victories, the uneven work of a young fighter figuring out how every discipline connects under pressure. He could box, but MMA demanded escapes, takedown awareness, submission defense patience, and decisions made, while another person tried to overwhelm him. Then, on September 7th, 2019, he made his professional debut against Gioni Palakaj at featherweight. Cutting all the way down to 145 pounds was a terrible decision for a man with Islam's height and frame. The weight cut went badly, his body looked drained, and after 3 full rounds, he lost by unanimous decision. That night remains the only professional loss of his career, but it is also the only time a professional fight involving Dulatov has reached the judges. There is something almost perfect about that in a documentary sense. His first night as a professional was the one night he looked human, and every victory since has ended with the other man unable to continue. Islam did not spend years trying to avenge the loss or pretend it never happened. He corrected the real problem, stopped forcing himself into a weight class that did not fit his body, and returned 7 weeks later at lightweight. Against Kolja Predojevic, he needed only 34 seconds to secure a rear naked choke. The difference was immediate. He was no longer a depleted prospect trying to survive 15 minutes. He was a long, violent athlete attacking the finish as soon as the opportunity appeared. In February of 2020, he fought Vladan Maksic at a 165-pound catchweight and secured another rear naked choke in 53 seconds. 2 straight professional victories had taken less than a minute each, and the loss was already beginning to look less like a limitation and more like an early warning that Islam had been competing in the wrong body. Then the pandemic slowed the regional scene and forced a long gap in his development. But when he returned in 2021, he settled into welterweight and started looking like the fighter people recognize now. Laith Najar lasted 44 seconds before punches ended the fight. Ibrahim Celik was stopped in the opening round. Georgi Kankava managed to survive the first 5 minutes, becoming the only opponent Islam has defeated who ever heard the bell for round 2, but he was knocked out before that second round could be completed. By then, the shape of Dulatov's game was becoming clear. He did not fight like a traditional point striker who wanted to stay at the end of his reach and collect rounds. He used his length to take space, backed opponents toward the fence, and attacked with the confidence of somebody who expected the first clean sequence to change the entire night. At the same time, those early rear naked chokes proved that rushing into a desperate takedown was not a safe escape. That balance made him uncomfortable to prepare for, stand with him, and deal with straight punches, knees, kicks, and that huge frame closing the distance. Wrestle carelessly and give him the neck or top position. The regional opponents were not elite UFC contenders, and the documentary should be honest about that, but Islam was doing exactly what a serious prospect is supposed to do with developing competition. He was not barely escaping. He was removing people from the cage before anyone had time to settle in, and every finish pushed that ugly debut loss a little farther into the distance. That stretch was less about padding a record than rebuilding his identity, one brutal result at a time, until the drained featherweight from his debut looked like a completely different fighter. By 2022, Islam was no longer simply rebuilding his confidence. He was creating a reputation across the European scene. In April, he faced Michael Rush in Dusseldorf and needed only 46 seconds to lock up a Bravo choke. 4 months later, Brave Combat Federation gave him a larger international platform against Cleverson Cruz, and Islam finished him with punches in the first round. That performance was important because every prospect eventually reaches the point where destroying small local opposition is no longer enough. The stage has to grow, the opponents have to become more experienced, and the pressure has to feel heavier. It also showed how quickly Islam could turn defense into offense. A rival might enter planning to neutralize the model's striking, only to discover that clinching or shooting created a completely different danger. Islam was developing the kind of finishing instinct that never pauses to admire a clean punch. When an opponent weakened, he swarmed until the referee intervened or a submission became unavoidable. Islam kept responding the same way. In March of 2023, Patrick Spurk was caught in an arm triangle choke after 48 seconds. Later that year, veteran Will Chope became another first-round finish. Chope had traveled everywhere, fought a massive list of opponents, and even experienced the UFC, but none of that experience bought him meaningful time against Dulatov. At this point, the fashion model label was becoming almost funny. People saw the cheekbones, the expensive campaigns, and the social media following, then assumed the fighting had to be some side project attached to his image. Once the cage door shut, there was nothing decorative about him. His body work was nasty. His knees came straight through the middle, and his elbows were built for opponents trapped along the fence. He carried the calm of a man who had performed under runway lights, but instead of posing, he was hunting. February of 2024 brought the biggest regional test of the run when Islam joined Octagon and faced Ioannis Palaiologos in Oberhausen. Palaiologos had far more professional experience and a dangerous submission background, making him the type of veteran who could punish an overconfident prospect. Islam spent the first round breaking him down and then landed the finishing attack at 4 minutes and 59 seconds, literally 1 second before the horn. The stoppage pushed him to 10-1 and extended a run in which every victory had come early. More importantly, the performance showed that he did not become frustrated when a tougher opponent survived the opening explosions. He continued attacking the body, maintained pressure, and found the finish at the final possible moment. His style had grown beyond raw aggression. At 6'3" with a long reach, he could have chosen to fight safely, circle the outside, and win behind volume. That is not how his mind works. Islam treats every exchange like a chance to end the evening. The punches draw the guard high, the knees and kicks punish the body, the elbows appear in the clinch, and the submissions sit underneath everything. If an opponent panics, he does leave questions, because he has spent so little time fighting deep into rounds. We still have not watched him manage a hard third round at welterweight, recover after being badly hurt, or solve an elite wrestler who can force him backward. Those are fair questions, but they exist because almost nobody has survived long enough to ask them inside the cage. By the summer of 2024, the UFC could no longer treat Dulatov as just an interesting German prospect. He had the look, the story, the audience, and most importantly, 10 professional victories without a single decision win. Dana White's Contender Series became the bridge between a fascinating European name and the biggest promotion in the sport, and Islam was finally standing at the entrance. His rise was no longer easy to dismiss as promotion or good looks. On October 8th, 2024, Islam walked into the UFC Apex for the most important audition of his life. Across from him stood Vanilto Antunes, a former LFA champion with enough experience to expose a prospect who had been protected by soft matchmaking. The assignment was simple in theory and brutal in reality. Win impressively while Dana White watched from a few feet away. Contender Series fights carry a strange pressure because winning alone does not guarantee anything. A fighter can spend years reaching that room, grind out a cautious decision, and still leave without the contract. Islam understood that the performance had to make White feel something. He did not perform like somebody begging for approval. He took the center, pushed Antunes backward, and made the smaller cage feel even tighter. Antunes survived the first attacks and tried to work along the fence, but at 2 minutes and 44 seconds, Islam created a sliver of space and fired a standing elbow directly into the temple. Antunes collapsed. Dana jumped out of his seat, and years of regional work ended with one of the cleanest knockouts of that Contender Series season. That elbow did more than finish a fight. It took Islam from European prospect lists and placed him on a global roster where every weakness would be studied. White told Islam that he was fun to watch and that he could not wait to see him compete again. The contract was finally real. Islam had reached the UFC without abandoning the personality that brought him there. 11 professional victories, 11 finishes, and no interest in being paid by the minute. Afterward, he made it clear that fashion would no longer control his schedule. He still had relationships in that world and was not ashamed of the career that helped change his family's life, but the UFC championship was now the priority. Of course, MMA rarely allows a clean fairy tale transition. His debut was booked against Adam Fugit for UFC Seattle in February of 2025, close enough for Islam to imagine the walk, the lights, and the moment his name would finally be announced inside the octagon. An undisclosed injury forced him out, turning the biggest opportunity of his career into another stretch of waiting. Fugit later withdrew from the replacement matchup too, and the entire fight disappeared from the card. 5 months later, the UFC put the original pairing back together at UFC 318 in New Orleans on the same event as Dustin Poirier's farewell fight. This time, Islam made the walk. Fugit tried to back away, change levels, and force wrestling exchanges along the fence, but Islam defended the takedowns, returned to open space, and continued controlling the center. Straight punches and leg kicks established the range. 2 knees narrowly missed ending the fight. Then, with less than a minute remaining in the first round, Fugit stepped into a check left hook that landed clean and dropped him. Islam followed him to the floor, fired the final punches, and at 4 minutes and 6 seconds, his UFC debut was over. The promotion awarded him a $50,000 Performance of the Night bonus. He told the crowd what the record already showed, 12 victories and 12 finishes. The funniest part came afterward when he said he was ready to return to his other job for a GQ shoot on Monday because his face was still clean. There he was, man, standing inside the UFC after knocking out a grown welterweight, thinking about cameras and clothes 2 days later. He also called for greater attention to European and German fighters, using his moment to speak for the scene that developed him. The refugee child, the runway model, and the knockout artist had finally become the same person on the largest stage in MMA. The contract changed expectations around him. Islam was no longer judged against developing European talent. Every appearance would still be compared with the deepest welterweight roster in the world, where one mistake could erase years of hype. The UFC debut looked like the beginning of a rapid rise, but the next chapter slowed down in a way nobody expected. Islam did not compete again for a full year. He later explained that personal family matters required his attention and that Ramadan also affected the timing of his return. That absence tells you something about his priorities. The championship dream is enormous, but family and faith still sit above the schedule. It also created pressure. Prospects live on momentum, and a year away can turn excitement into doubt before the second UFC appearance ever happens. When everything was settled, the UFC booked him against Wellington Turman for July of 2026 in Abu Dhabi. Turman had competed at both middleweight and welterweight, trained around elite fighters, and possessed the experience to test areas of Islam's game that 12 quick finishes had left hidden. The placement made the opportunity feel even larger. Islam was scheduled near the top of his first UFC main card, fighting in a region filled with fans who understood his background and faith. Days before the event, another layer was added when he announced that he had obtained Turkish citizenship and would begin representing Turkey inside the UFC after previously carrying the German flag. For a Chechen-born refugee raised in Dusseldorf, the decision created a complicated identity that stretched across 3 places, but Islam described carrying the Turkish flag as an honor and thanked the country for its support. He arrived in Abu Dhabi, completed fight week, and officially weighed 171 pounds. The stare-down happened. The fight appeared safe. Then, on the night before the event, Islam was taken to the hospital with an infection and required hours of treatment. Only a few hours before the card began, the UFC canceled the Turman fight entirely. His team said the decision was made with the promotion to protect his health and allow a complete recovery. Turman was understandably furious after spending years recovering from 4 shoulder surgeries and completing an entire camp. He later accused Islam's team of mishandling the post-weigh-in rehydration process and claimed shakes recommended by a bodybuilding coach contributed to the illness. That is Turman's allegation, not a confirmed medical finding. So the responsible way to tell the story is to present both sides without pretending we know what happened inside that hospital. The confirmed facts are that Islam made weight, became sick, was admitted for treatment, and lost his second UFC appearance at the final possible moment. As of now, no replacement date has been announced. Dulatov is 28 years old, 12-1 as a professional, riding 12 consecutive victories, and every single win has ended by knockout or submission. 11 of those 12 victories came in the first round, yet his UFC resume still contains only 4 minutes and 6 seconds of actual cage time. That is what makes the ending so interesting. Islam has already lived enough lives for 3 different documentaries, but as a UFC fighter, his story has barely moved beyond the opening scene. The talent is violent, the presence is undeniable, and the ambition is to become champion, but now comes the part that no runway, highlight reel, or family success can answer for him. He has to stay healthy, remain active, face opponents who can drag him into uncomfortable territory, and prove that the Ripper is more than one of the coolest introductions in the sport. He began life surrounded by war, rebuilt it in Germany, conquered fashion, recovered from defeat, and punched his way into the UFC. The belt is still far away, but considering where Islam Dulatov started, distance has never been the part of the journey that frightened him. That unfinished feeling makes his next appearance carry weight. It will not simply be another fight. It will give the first answer to whether all that early destruction can survive the demands of the long UFC climb.